The new national minimum wage is set to go up from 25.42 cents, 25 rand 42 cents to 27 rand 58 cents, effective from the 1st of March. The increase will apply to most workers, including farm and domestic workers. The national minimum wage is a minimum amount of pay that an employer is legally required to remunerate employees for work done. The Department of Labour emphasized that the amount does not include payment of allowances such as transport, food or accommodation. So how will employees benefit or face challenges from these adjustments? Let's now bring in the legal director at the Strata-G Labour Solutions, Advocate Tertius Wessels. Advocate Wessels, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Good morning, Aldrin, and good morning to the viewers.
South Africa has a national minimum wage. If you cannot pay a national minimum wage, what happens?
So even though that we do have this national minimum wage, the National Minimum Wage Act does make provisions for employers to apply for exemption from paying the national minimum wage. There's obviously various criteria that needs to be considered, and it predominantly depends on an employer's financial viability to pay the wage, and it would be for an employer to illustrate that they are not in a position to pay it. Currently, as it stands, an employer would only be entitled to ask for a 10% reduction on the national minimum wage, and that would only be exempt for a period of 1 year. Obviously, we know and understand that the bulk of employees that benefit from the increase in the national minimum wage are those that are employed as domestic workers or as farm workers. And it's often these households that become the predominant employer. And we don't often see very much that these individual employers make these applications for exemption from paying the national minimum wage.
Yeah, and that's what I was about to ask. That does the legislation distinguish between an employer who is an individual who owns a household and has employed a domestic worker vis-a-vis an employer which is a company that actually has cleaners that work there?
Yeah, so the law does not distinguish. An employer is ultimately somebody that employs somebody to render services to them. And that person, as an employer, is required and bound to pay and comply with the national minimum wage. We do know and understand that there are certain industries or sectors where you have large corporations and you have organized labor in those industries and sectors. And very often their agreements in respect of wages are regulated differently through collective agreements. We've seen this over the years within the motor industry. We've even seen it in the public sector as well, where there are these wage agreements that are in effect, and the employers are then required to comply over a period of time with whatever has been agreed upon with labour.
Yeah. Advocate Wessels, take us now into the formula that is applied by the Minister, because the Minister makes reference to also taking into consideration the economic state of the country as well as the socio-economic conditions of some of the people who are employed, but also of those people that are also employers. So what formula is followed here? This just over 8.5% increase is above CPI.
Yeah, so we know that CPI is currently standing at about 6%. And when one looks at the formula that they apply, there are these various factors that you've mentioned that are taken into account. We've also seen that the Minister over time and the National Minimum Wage Commission embark upon a process that involves consultation not only with employers but also with labour, employees, in an attempt to try and understand what would be the best possible increase to apply to the national minimum wage. We have seen over the years that, for example, that we had 1 million domestic workers pre-COVID. Yeah. When COVID then happened, we subsequently saw that number drastically reduce to about 250,000. And currently in the market, we still see about 150,000 domestic workers struggling to find the employment that they once had. So there's a variety of factors that one then needs to consider in order to determine what is viable. Because at the end of the day, when we see that those individual employers that are not receiving inflation-related increases, that are receiving below increases, their affordability starts being questioned, and the means by which they are then able to afford their domestic workers becomes problematic.
Yeah. Does the legislation make provision for a family that has a household that has employed, for instance, a domestic worker or even somebody who works in the garden, to have a conversation with them, so it is employee-employer conversation outside of involving the Commission or applying for an exemption, to say that, okay, the national legislation now says that the minimum wage has now increased to 27.58, 27 Rand 58 cents. I can't afford the 27 Rand 58 cents. Can I go into negotiation with my employee without involving applying for an exemption?
So what we need to understand first and foremost is that even though the relationship exists between the employer and employee, you cannot contract outside of the law. If the rate is 27.58, then that is the rate that the employer needs to pay the employee for each hour worked. However, that doesn't preclude the employer and the employee from engaging in a conversation regarding affordability and then reaching an agreement, for example, to reduce the number of hours that the employee will be working on a particular day in order to derive a saving, or to minimize the number of actual days worked in a particular week. If you cut an hour every single day, that can derive the saving that is ultimately needed, while still ensuring that the person is paid at the right rate per hour and that you can retain them in your employ.
Advocate Wessels, what's the rationale behind the South African government setting up a national minimum wage per hour, however, though the same government exempting itself from the program, like, for instance, in EPW, where the EPW workers get less than what the minimum wage is, which again is determined by the state?
Yeah, so we all know that the whole lead up to implementing this national minimum wage is in order to create what many people want to have a so-called living wage at the end of the day. And we know and understand that a living wage is not something that is currently affordable for many employers in South Africa. And the introduction of this national minimum wage is to ensure that we at least make some form of progress to protect those that are very often the most vulnerable employees in the economy. Over the years, we unfortunately have built a reputation where there has been a misuse or abuse of legislation, or employers wanting to try and circumvent the legislation. And what we've seen happening over the years is tighter mechanisms being introduced in order to ensure that those most vulnerable are reaping some form of benefit, and that they are protected at the end of the day.
Yeah. Advocate Wessels, just finally, for some people listening into this conversation, for those people whose employers do not pay the minimum wage, what recourse do they have?
So first and foremost, they would have the option of either approaching the Department of Employment and Labour for inspections to be conducted. The inspectors normally then assess whether or not the employer complies with not only the national minimum wage but other labour laws, and where they are found to be in contravention, they face the issue of penalties or fines being imposed upon them. And then employees also have a recourse by approaching the CCMA in order for claims under the National Minimum Wage Act.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Advocate Tertius Wessels, Legal Director at Strata-G Labour Solutions. So remember, that minimum wage comes into effect from tomorrow, the 1st of March.